I'm Richard O'Donoghue, and you're welcome to another podcast from Finance Connect on the European asset finance industry. It's hard to believe we've been doing these podcasts for over a year, and thanks to our sponsorship from Alpha Systems, we're continuing with these into 2026. One of our first ever guests on the podcasts was Richard Huston, the CEO of VAMOS AI. Today, I'm delighted to welcome back Richard to discuss all things AI, and particularly some misconceptions that many of us may have. Richard, congratulations on being our first ever two-time guest, and welcome back.
Hi, Richard. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me back. For those of you who don't know me, as Richard said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of VAMOS. We specialize in applied AI for operations in asset finance, so particularly focusing on back office operations. It's really great to be back, Richard.
Good to have you back. So we spoke 12 months ago. Has anything happened in the world of AI since then?
Not much. I can't think of anything. I was trying to think back on, when did we record the last one of these, and then think about what were the things that I would pick out, and it's a really dizzying list. We've got the obvious things with continued rollout of new models, new capabilities. But I think the thing that people will have noticed much more is certain kind of headline grabbing things. So if people have seen OpenClaw, which kind of landed around the start of this year, and a lot of people got excited about the idea of some persistent agent that could help them with things in their life. Though I think that one is a little bit more of a niche one, but things that have been impacting people much more are things like, a lot more people are using Claude now. So I think that was one of the things I was sort of recommending to people to try out when we did this podcast. And it's nice now that when I talk about Claude and Anthropic, people know what I'm talking about now, which is quite nice.
Well, last year when you mentioned Claude, I thought it was one of our French listeners. Now you can see me nodding as I now know what it is. And I think is it 4.6 that I should be aware of?
Well, we're on 4.7 now.
Oh, 4.7, I'm behind the times.
This is the joke in the AI world. It's like, if you blink for a moment and then you've missed what's come out and what's changed in the last week. It can be a little dizzying at times, but it's also, I think it's interesting to note that, because there were predictions about, okay, well, will we continue to see further advances, or will you kind of hit a plateau? So far, there's no real sign of it slowing down, but sometimes, the advances we're seeing are not so much necessarily in the models themselves, although those do continue to get better. It's in how they're actually being applied, how they're being used. And you'll have seen things from Anthropic where, a big part of their kind of recent explosion in revenue is due to the tools that they're rolling out, right? They've got, Claude Code, right, as kind of completely taken over the world of software development in the last 12 months or so, and kind of rightly so. It's a really remarkable tool, but that's where it's really interesting, and I kind of think back to some of the conversations I had again last year, and we talked about how integrating AI into work was where it was going to be really interesting, and we see a lot more of that now with tools like Claude Code.
Just maybe elaborate on that a little bit. Like, there seems to be these constant launches, it goes 4.6 to 4.7. What's happening behind the scenes? What's better about the next model up, and how does it get better?
Yeah, it's really interesting because obviously the labs, so OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, they don't give away any of their secret sauce. So they don't tell you really what they're doing. So you've got to kind of infer what it is that they're doing. There's kind of very briefly, there's two parts to training these models. There's first of all training them on vast amounts of data, which takes a long time, and then there's at the end of that kind of refining the model where you're kind of giving it specific feedback on its behavior. And I think both the labs continue to do both things, but my gut feel is where they're getting the most mileage is on the second step there, where they're refining the behavior. They're doing very specific. And the reasons they're doing this is if you think about Claude Code, right, for example. So what they've done with Claude Code is they've kind of built what we call a harness, right? So you take the AI model, but you actually run it inside this agent harness. And an agent really is a fancy way of saying trying to get the AI to independently figure out what to do and then be able to do it. But all this is just code running in a loop, right? So Claude Code is just some code that says, I'm going to have a loop, and the user has given me some instructions they want me to do. I'm going to call to the AI model with those instructions. It's going to give me its first idea of what it should do next. And then you just run that loop over and over and over again until, calling back to the AI model at each step until it kind of navigates its way to some kind of result. Now, it might be the result that you want, or it might be completely, erroneous kind of result. And that's the interesting thing about working with those kind of AI agents, is that there's a lot of, it's completely non-deterministic. You don't really know where it's going to go, and you just kind of hope that it ends up in vaguely the right place. But that's what they're working on a lot with that refinement of the. They're trying to make them better at following those instructions and going step by step and completing long tasks. Okay. So we just had a model come out, I think it was yesterday. So a model's just landed from OpenAI, GPT 5.5. And the big thing that they're advertising there about that is it's really good at long running tasks. Like you could literally leave it running in that kind of a loop, running on a task for hours. And some people have been working on that. And again, the industry where that's kind of taking off the most is software development, because there's lots of tasks that it's very well suited to. But it is likely we'll start to see that come into other places as well.
And again, you kind of mentioned there about the training of the AI models. I mean, maybe this is a starting point in a misconception, or maybe it's accurate. Every time any of us go on ChatGPT or go on Claude or any of the other models, is our data being used to train those AI models?
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up a lot. And I guess the short answer is it depends, but it basically depends on whether you're using a consumer or free version of the tool or a business version, right? Because the conversation we have most commonly with people is that, if you are setting this up and using this as a business, whether that's going directly to Anthropic or OpenAI and signing up there for one of their business accounts, or whether you're accessing it through one of the hyperscalers like Google or AWS, you're going on an enterprise plan there, and they will never train on your, as of right now, I mean, they'd be pretty crazy to do that, right? So they will never train on your data, because it would really fundamentally break the entire business model of trying to sell these things to enterprise customers, right? No one would do it. So they very quickly realized, I mean, I know why people have this, I know why it comes up so often is because when ChatGPT launched, the entire purpose was to gather training data. It was an experiment. It was never even, when they launched it, they never even intended for it to be a product. It was launched as an experiment. And so everything you did with that was gathering the data and was using it for further training. And it's still the case that if you're, on a free plan for one of these things, that's saying that, if you're not paying, then you're the product, right? So if you're on a free plan for something, then you should probably expect that it is going to be training on your data. But if you're on a business plan, and, always carefully read the terms and conditions, but generally those business and enterprise plans, they do not train on your data. And you can even go further, so obviously we work with enterprise customers, and that's, kind of the top concern really. And so when we're building and working on Google Cloud, for example, we even kind of have agreements in place with Google Cloud so that, none of it is logged, because by default, Google, for all these things, they have kind of logging and abuse monitoring for general consumer purposes. But for enterprise customers, we even get all of that disabled as well. So the data really isn't, being stored or used for any training or any further analysis or anything like that.
So let's assume most of the people listening to this are going to be working in the industry, and therefore they're on enterprise models. So does that mean that as they put queries in or look for tasks to be done by the AI agent that they're operating on, that it's not learning from those interactions? How does that work? Does it learn just from the interactions of the people in the company, or how does it become better, I guess?
Well, so that's it. Kind of an interesting misconception, because actually the vast majority of times it is not learning as it goes. So it is, sitting behind these things, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT, it is effectively a static model, right? It has been trained, and when they've finished with training that particular version, they stamp a version number on it, like Opus 4.6 or 4.7, and that's it. That's that model. Interestingly, sometimes people notice that the quality of those models can vary, and that's another layer that sits behind it, where sometimes they give them more compute, so the model is actually allowed to think for longer. But actually, in terms of learning stuff on the go, no, these models, they have to be kind of actively, in almost all cases, they have to be actively trained as part of a training run. So they're never learning as they go. Although interesting, there's a new startup out of the UK that's just raised, I think, $500 million in funding to tackle exactly this, to have AI models that learn as they go. Because it would be, well, it's both a pro and a con, I guess, because, you would be getting it kind of learning your stuff as it goes, but then some people might be a bit uncomfortable with that. But at the moment, the models that you're using in all of these kind of use cases, they are not learning anything as they go. And the only information they have, and this comes to a topic called context engineering, right? The only information they have is the context that you give them within the moment at which you send that data to them. You're sending it to the model with all of that context.
Mhm.
It's giving you its answer back, and that's it. It doesn't remember any of that. Now, there's slight complication to that because they can kind of do some caching for performance, but basically the model is not learning or remembering anything from that. So you have the job then of making sure that all the information it needs goes in that context.
So misconception one that I had was my data is being used to train the model. So if I'm on an enterprise platform, it's not. And then it's not learning as it goes along. It really only learns as the model moves, say, from 4.6 to 4.7. That's the point at which it's learned. And then, as you say, it's fixed thereafter until it goes to 4.8 or maybe 5.1. But I don't quite know how they work out the numbering conventions.
At least they're on slightly more sensible numbering than they used to be. There used to be this insane situation with the OpenAI models where you had a model called 4.0 and another model called O 4, and it was just impossible to work out what was going on. So they've all gotten a little bit more sensible with the numbering, at least, finally.
It sounds good. And you showed off by talking about Opus, which truthfully is not one I've used. But a broader point then, should people use multiple AI models to validate what they are doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it is generally a pretty good practice because it's something, we kind of leverage a lot is that, you can't, everyone kind of knows you can't fully trust the answer from a large language model. You can get some extra reassurance from using completely different ones. So if you, put this into Claude, put it into ChatGPT and put it into Gemini and get 3 different answers, but you might get some kind of consensus on something, that can be quite useful. The other reason, though, that I really recommend people try different models is just sometimes they're better for different purposes. So there's a lot of why I was always recommending people to try Claude is I find that it's a lot more grounded in terms of, it's less likely to go off and invent something or kind of, it really for kind of work purposes felt much more grounded in reality. And that was the reason I liked it. But then some people like Gemini because they find it really great for planning things, right? So actually it's a weird thing, but you find the models have like subtly different behaviors. They have, different things that they're stronger or better at. And also, again, back to the thing of, new versions coming out all the time. If you've kind of tried an earlier version of Gemini and weren't particularly impressed, well, now you might want to go and try, Gemini 3.1 Pro and go, oh, actually, the capabilities on this are really good now, actually.
So another thing that, I guess a year ago, and certainly when I first started using AI models 2 or 3 years ago, the big emphasis was on prompts and being very precise in how you prompted the model so that it would give you the most accurate answer possible. Where are we today regarding the importance of accurate prompts?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I know certainly when ChatGPT first came out and we were talking about models like GPT 3.5, they were less capable, and it was more important how you framed your questions and how you put the prompt together. And that's kind of not so much the case anymore. Now I'll come on to what is important in a second, which is that context engineering point I mentioned, which in effect is the prompt, right? Because the prompt is everything you pass into the model. But actually, this idea of prompt engineering or being a prompt engineer, I'm a little bit skeptical of because it's no longer the case with these latest models that you really have to carefully, craft every single word and make sure you have the right magic incantation. The models are very, very capable now, and especially when they're in these agentic harnesses as well, where they basically, work in a loop and try and figure out what you're asking and what information they need. I've shown demos to people where I give the vaguest, shortest of instructions, but because it has access to the right files and context and information, it's able to understand what I'm saying when I say, for example, let's continue working, right? If I say let's continue working to the kind of Claude Co-work, right? So this is another great tool.
I've heard about this. Maybe talk a little bit about Claude Co-work when you're talking.
Yeah, so Claude Co-work, I'll kind of explain it because it kind of explains that part of why prompt engineering is not quite so crucial anymore, and it's more about this context engineering. So basically, the engineers at Anthropic, they created Claude Code, and if you've seen it, the main interface for it is in like a terminal, right? Like command line. It looks like, you're working in the Matrix. And so for non-technical people, it wasn't, it's not really designed for them. It was intended for coding. But what the engineers at Anthropic noticed was that a lot of people had started adopting it to do non-coding tasks. They had used it to organize files on their desktop because it runs on your machine. It goes and calls out to Anthropic AI models, but the actual tool runs on your computer. And so you can give it access to files and folders selectively. You can choose what it has access to. And so people were starting to use it for all sorts of tasks, right? And so Anthropic noticed this. And in January, they launched something called Cowork, which is part of the Claude app on desktop and is designed for non-technical people. But what sits behind the scenes of that is basically the same Claude code, kind of agent harness that we were talking about, where it's trying to, respond to what you've asked for and figure out how to solve the problems and do things for you, but in a slightly nicer user interface and interaction. Yeah. And they've really, they've had big success with that in the last couple of months in terms of, realizing that it's a very powerful tool. They've added support for Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and things like that. I had a good time showing Edward Peck and Eva how Cowork works a while back, and I know Edward really likes using it for working on conference material and stuff. It's a really helpful tool. So Cowork, if I just say to it, oh, okay, I want to continue working on this file on my desktop, and I've given it access to that folder, I don't really need to tell it much else. I don't need to craft some big, clever prompt around it, because it can go and get the context that it needs. It can go and get the file. It will read that file by itself, and then it will come back to me and say, oh, okay, I know what we're doing here now. Where do you want to carry on? It looks like you were on this part of this document. And so that's the big shift from sort of the need to craft everything carefully in one big prompt to giving it access to the context that it needs to help you achieve the task. And that's been the big shift over the last probably only about 6 months or so, really.
So it reads what you've given it access to and establishes the context and therefore determines what you need to do next. That's
and we've internally at VAMOS, we've moved really far with this because we use Notion as our internal kind of document, information storage base. And there's a Notion MCP. So for people who haven't heard of MCP, it's just a way of letting an AI model communicate with some other system. And this Notion MCP allows Claude Cowork to access any of the documents and any of the information that we've got stored centrally in Notion as a company. And so I will just have conversations about, something we're working on, that day, and it will go and look up the context it needs. So I've kind of got to the point where I don't feel the need I'll just say, I'm talking to Richard later and, or we've got the Finance Connect conference in a couple of weeks, and it knows what that means because it goes and reads all of that context in our Notion. And that's a big jump from kind of how we were having to use these tools previously, where you'd be like, oh, I need to pull in the right information or I need to give it all of this in the prompt.
And again, just back to the earlier question, it's not sharing that data anywhere else. It's just purely internal, and it's almost like you've got your own little personal AI tool that's looking at your own data and drawing conclusions.
Yeah. So it's kind of yes, kind of no. So because we've got these, it's like any SaaS, software as a service subscription, really. So obviously we've got Notion storing our data. We're then accessing that from Claude Code or Claude Cowork, and we are sending that data to the Anthropic servers where they have the AI model running, and then they're giving us the result back. But Anthropic are not storing that, other than in the context. Well, they might store some of the conversation history for us in the context of our enterprise account, but it's the same as really any other enterprise SaaS tool. Right. Now, the interesting thing is you could equally do the same thing, but with a model running locally if you had a powerful enough laptop, which is not that, some of the top-end MacBooks are very capable of running very good local models, and we've just had a couple of weeks ago the latest set of open source models from Google, the Gemma 4 models, and they come in different sizes. They've got 2 of them that are designed to run on mobile, actually, which is quite cool, and they're actually surprisingly good for how small they are, and then 2 of them that are designed to run on reasonably powerful laptops. We're getting to the point where, there are models that are good enough for this sort of thing that you can run on your laptop, and then you don't have to send it anywhere.
So it continues to develop at pace is probably the conclusion here. Now, a quick word about our sponsors, Alpha. In our industry, we're constantly talking about new technologies and opportunities, particularly around intelligent document processing and other AI solutions. If you want to truly seize those opportunities, that's where Alpha comes in. Alongside full functionality for origination, servicing and collections, the Alpha Systems platform brings sophisticated tooling, helping you drive automation and sustainability, manage complex portfolios, and enhance the customer experience. Find out more at alphasystems.com. Again, just sort of back to data, and maybe this again is another misconception. Certainly a year ago, there was a view that you had to train the models on your own data for them to be effective. And again, I guess this is where we're talking about an enterprise environment, and they want to be protective of their own data. Is that still the case, or have the models developed in a different way?
So I think for most people, they can get an awful lot of value out of using the models as they come from the lab, so to speak, without needing to train on their own data. Now, that's not to say, that sometimes when people are looking at what to do with training AI models on their own data, there are genuine competitive advantages that you might have from training something on your own data. If you have enough data, and if you have some specialists in AI and machine learning. So the big banks, they do fantastically well out of this, in terms of fraud data, fraud analysis. And Revolut just came out with something where they've sort of trained the equivalent of a large language model, but instead of training it on language, they've trained it on transactions. I still can't figure out what you're going to do with that, but it sounds extremely clever. So it's very interesting. Announced it about a week ago, so I still need to dig into that and actually understand exactly what's going on with that. But so if you're Revolut, or if you're Lloyds Bank and stuff, and you have both the size of the data and the machine learning capability, then there are some interesting things to do there. But I kind of often advise people that, you don't need to be training something on all of your own data to get value out of it. Back to the point I was just making about how, Claude Cowork accesses the information in our Notion and has that context. And it's just a very good general purpose model. So we're able to use it for everything that we need within our business, and just by giving it that access to that information and that context. And I know a lot of people, this is one of the directions some people are starting to look at as they explore more of the Microsoft Copilot Agent Studio and some of the things that they can do there and how they connect it to some of their sources of data. So yeah, I think that's been a bit of a common misconception that the only way to do anything interesting with these AI things is to be training a model. And actually the reality is most of the interesting stuff going on right now is taking an existing model and building interesting things around it.
And if you do decide to use your own data, I mean, the other thing that people always said was you have to clean it up. It has to be perfect so that the model can understand it. Again, have the models moved beyond that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting because, as you say, this does come up a lot as well. And sometimes people think it's a bit of a blocker. Obviously, it's better if your data is in a better state. But the slight irony is that these large language models are actually the perfect tool to help you try and tidy some of that up. So let's take two different types of data as an example, because I like to be more specific than just, talk generally in data. So if we were to talk about your more structured data in a contract management system, well, actually, that's already really well suited because it's structured. It's generally going to be kind of more up to date, higher quality data that you can use. And, you can use, I think we've talked about it before, maybe on the previous one, but you can use the APIs of these systems. So the ways of integrating to these systems to access that data, it's structured by its very nature, reasonably high quality and up to date. And then you can start exploring things to do with that data, whether it's, plugging AI things on top using the API or that sort of thing. So that's on the structured data, where a lot of people are actually probably in a better position than they realize. I guess it depends on how accessible that data is, right? That's really the key thing. If you've got easy access to that data, that makes a big difference to what you're able to do. The second one is kind of on the more unstructured data, and an example, sort of policies and procedures, right? And SOPs at a business. Those, it's been really interesting in conversations recently because people, in theory, people have those documented and they should be relatively up to date. But then as people are kind of coming to them and looking at building them into some kind of chatbot or agent or thing like that, they're realizing, actually, maybe they're not quite as up to date as I would like, or maybe this one contradicts this other one because we didn't notice that. And you do have some work to do there, right? If you've got lots of documents like that, but previously that would have been a lot of effort for someone to go through. Actually, use the LLM to help you with this, right? So if I face any where I've got lots of documents and I'm not sure which ones I might need to update or which ones I might need to combine, I'll lean on the AI to help me do that. I'll still make the final decision myself. So I would encourage people to think of it in that way, in terms of, yes, my current data for some of these things might not be perfect, but actually I have a tool here that's really good for helping me to sort that out. So I shouldn't necessarily let that be a blocker.
Very interesting. Yes. So again, a lot has changed from where we were 12 months ago, or certainly where we were 24 months ago. One thing to maybe just touch on as well, sort of broader issues. So AI, Is it going to replace software? Because we've seen, particularly with SaaS companies, we've seen a lot of talk about it's going to completely replace them. Their share prices are in the doldrums as a result of it. You come from a software background. Would you train as a software engineer again? Where do you see this going?
Yeah, the SaaS apocalypse, right?
Apocalypse, yeah. And just for clarity, we're not offering investment advice here. I think we do.
I do. It does come up in conversations with investors quite a bit, and obviously all the major PE firms are kind of, I don't know if they're panicking, but they're definitely sort of trying to figure out what their position is on this. And I think it was Tom Bravo's position, and I would kind of agree with it, is that it's definitely been overblown in terms of, the big market sell off every time Anthropic launches some new feature is really ridiculous, because most of the software products we're talking about are really firmly embedded in the core running of a business and are not things that are going to easily be replaced by AI, right? It just doesn't make sense. Again, I give a nod to our sponsors, because a software like Alpha, that sits at the heart of a business, and it's very transactional, deterministic, needs to be robust. That's not going to be replaced by either by AI itself or by someone vibe coding a replacement. Because obviously that's the concern people have, is that, what's left of the moat for software companies. I do think it's interesting for some of the, you've got sort of Salesforce and others where they're a bit more of a general thing that people kind of build different things on top of. I think they're realizing that that's maybe slightly more open to attack, because, there's more, as people can build more software more quickly, more specialized tools are coming out. And a business might have decided previously, I can probably just about make this work on Salesforce and do what I want to do. And now there's going to be this whole range of, more specialized tools. So, but I just think that's an interesting time for software, right? And actually, you talked about kind of software developers. Would I choose to be a software developer again? Yeah, kind of. Well, the job is changing. So the most interesting job in tech right now is, I guess, a product engineer, I guess is how you would describe it, where you're doing a mix of what previously would have been like a product designer or a product manager's role, where you're thinking about what should we build? And then you're using the AI tools to be able to just prototype those and test those and build those more quickly. And actually really nicely is put them in the hands of customers after just doing a quick bit of prototyping and going, do you think this is good? Do you think this would be a useful tool? So I think this might be kind of a really exciting sort of renaissance for software, where we've all had to kind of live with really big SaaS products that are quite generalist, and you kind of go, I can probably make this fit to my needs. And actually, maybe we're entering this place, and I say this a lot to people as well, if they're any kind of domain specialist in an area, it's a great opportunity if they're interested in building, products or tools in that area. Now is a great time to do that, because the most valuable thing actually is that domain expertise in an area. That's the thing that's going to make a software business kind of more robust in the long term. I'm not giving investment advice, but I think that's what's going to make a software business more robust in the long term, is if it's got a really good, strong domain understanding of a specific domain, and it really solves that niche, that problem really, really well.
So domain expertise versus general, that's kind of your view. Okay, so software companies, it's probably going to be somewhat selective. Some will do very well out of this. Some may have to reinvent themselves. What about people? Again, we're seeing a lot of layoffs. We're seeing companies saying that we're letting people go because we're able to do things with AI. Are we doomed?
There's going to be a lot of disruption, obviously. It's a bit unavoidable with any kind of major tech wave. And we've seen this with previous, bringing in computers into offices. There was disruption. I don't think, you see a lot in the news about massive AI-based layoffs at this company or that company. I think that's mostly a smokescreen for layoffs that they were going to do anyway. Right. I genuinely... think about it, right? A lot of these big companies like Microsoft and Meta and others, they go through periodic big layoffs, right, in rounds. And now they have a perfect excuse that sounds great to investors to say, oh yes, but it's because we're using AI so brilliantly that we just don't need all those people. I think they would have laid those people off anyway, because that's the kind of cycle they operate in. But it makes for a great headline. It sounds good to investors. So I don't give that much credence, and it's not what I'm seeing directly. What I'm actually seeing, the businesses that we're working with that are kind of adopting this the fastest are doing it to grow, right? They're doing it because they're frustrated that their growth is constrained by always needing more people to do some of these tasks. For example, when we spoke with Haydock, one of our customers, Haydock, we spoke at the last Finance Connect conference. The big focus there was not on like, oh, can we replace people or anything like that? It's, can you give faster service to brokers? Can you handle more deals coming in the door effectively, efficiently, with the same level of accuracy? It's just a tool that people will use to try and meet some of those goals. And that's what I see happening in most cases. Now, yes, there will still be situations where I think, certain jobs are going to be very heavily affected and already have been. But I also see people reinventing their roles, right? So I see people kind of going, okay, well, what does my job look like with AI? What does it look like when I use these tools? And actually, I can deliver 4 times more work, perhaps as a designer, for example, right? So, one of my colleagues has been a graphic designer for 20 years, and she looks at these tools as an exciting thing because they let her do more. So I think there's a bit of a, kind of classic thing that every time we go through one of these technical revolutions, it is disruptive. And, it is unfortunate that there will be some job losses out of it, but it's the same as previous tech waves where it creates new opportunities, new jobs, and a lot of businesses will just use it to do more.
So if somebody was leaving school or leaving university at the moment, they're concerned about their futures, the future of the industries they're going into, the value of what they've learned. What advice would you give them based on, how you see AI disrupting, I guess, traditional work?
I think 2 things. I think one is I would definitely advise them to spend a lot of time using the latest AI tools so that when they come into the workplace, they are as useful as they can be. And actually, odds are they will then be in a position to help advise other people at that business about using AI. So that's one piece of advice. But the other one actually is back to the domain expertise thing. It's like, pick an area of business and just learn it really well, right? That is not going away. The expertise in an area of business, judgment, right? That's what we build that up over years of working in an area of business. That LLMs, AI cannot replace that judgment. I mean, the models get better, and yet they still have absolutely terrible judgment sometimes. And you feel like there's moments where you feel like you're kind of just playing on a slot machine almost, in terms of whether it's going to give you the kind of the result that you would have gone for with something, or something completely wrong. So you still, that human judgment, at least for the moment, is completely irreplaceable. And so, yeah, when I'm talking to young people, that's kind of what I advise is get into some area of business and really immerse yourself in it and become really interested in. And I think, us within the asset finance industry, back when we were at the event in Cologne, I was really recommending people look at doing internships, graduate schemes, apprenticeships, whatever you can do to bring, hungry young people into this business. Because when people come in, it's a great area to learn. People will really, if they really throw themselves into it, that's where you'll have that differentiation between young people being able to come in, and AI can't replace that. It can't replace someone coming in and really becoming an expert in the business. So I hope we see that, because I also fear a little bit for young people. I think it's a really difficult job market at the moment. And so I'm kind of trying to bang the drum for like businesses to think about how they make pathways in for young people, and give them that opportunity to learn those businesses from the ground up.
I mean, it's very encouraging, and what you're saying, and I think we would all agree with that. And this is an interesting industry, and it's a specialist industry. So having domain expertise, this is an industry where domain expertise matters. So that's very encouraging to hear. Let's kind of end on a positive note. Look out another 12 months. What do you think will happen over the next 12 months? Where do you think things will go?
This is like the hardest question in the world of AI. My sort of joke would be like, if anyone tells you, it's like that quantum physics thing of like, if someone says they understand quantum physics, they don't understand quantum physics. So if someone tells you they can predict where AI is going to be in 12 months and they don't understand AI, but I'll try my crystal ball.
Try and we'll play it back in 12 months. And
this would be a good test.
And what we do is we'll ask Claude for its prediction and we'll compare the two.
So I think the current trend of it getting tied more tightly into your existing business tools, that's going to be the big thing over the next 12 months. The labs will keep coming out with better and better models, but that's not really the thing that moves the dial the most. It's when it actually ties into what you're doing. So co-work for me is the big thing this year at the moment, and I think will continue along those lines. The other labs and the other companies will have to come out with similar stuff. I mean, Microsoft recognized this so much that they basically have now they've signed an agreement with Anthropic to put co-work into Copilot. So co-work was so much better at doing this kind of actual work stuff than Copilot, that there's now a partnership to bring a co-work into Copilot, which is interesting. So we'll keep seeing that. I think Anthropic are going to swallow some parts of the software industry. So if something is not very domain specific, if it's quite generalist, then there is a risk there that Anthropic, because what's happening at Anthropic is the engineers there within Anthropic have basically unlimited usage almost of their own AI models for coding. So they have a massive advantage over other software companies, and they just keep churning out more and more tools and little features in the Claude app. They just came out with like interactive, like live updating dashboards, which starts to threaten a whole other area of software. So I think watch out for what Anthropic's releasing and what it's doing to certain parts of the software industry. But as I said, like the more specialized and domain specific bits are pretty safe. And then watch out for where those integrations go into your existing stack. And it's a good advice actually for people to kind of look at where can you integrate an AI tool into your existing stuff? I almost entirely make our decisions about internal tools now based on how well they can integrate with Claude. So if I were to go and evaluate something for use at VAMOS now and it didn't have a way of having Claude interact with it, I'd probably just say no, we'd go and find an alternative. So yeah, I think that would be my prediction over the next 12 months, is that continued integration of these things into the tools that you're already using, and people learning what that means for how you run your business, how it fits into those workflows. There's a lot of learning there for people, but I think it's also once you kind of see it, once I show people the kind of stuff that co-work can do, then they kind of start to go, oh, okay. And the wheels, the cogs start turning, and they start thinking about all the places across their business where that could make such a big difference.
Well, look, as always, Richard, it's great to talk to somebody who's so passionate about AI and can also explain it to sort of people in terms that I think all of us can understand. So appreciate your time this morning. Again, last time we spoke, I went off and started using Claude. So I find Claude is very, very good. It's very polite as well. I think it's much politer than other AI models. It always welcomes me by name in the morning. And I think this time my homework will be to go and understand a little bit more about co-work, because that certainly seems to be an interesting development. And again, I've heard a little bit about it, but it seems to be something that's going to accelerate. So as always, thanks for coming in, sharing your thoughts. And maybe we'll do this again in 12 months and we'll go back and see if your predictions have proven to be correct. But thanks for your time today, Richard.
Thank you, Richard. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Finance Connect. This is the first of a series of podcasts on the impact of AI in the asset finance industry. And in our next podcast, we'll chat with Brian Murphy from our sponsors, Alpha Systems, about the use of AI in their own business and how their customers are using it. Reflecting back on today's chat with Richard, the thing that really struck me is the relentless pace of change in AI. It seems like there are new developments every single day, and it's going to be really difficult for us to keep up with all that's happening. I also wonder if there's a risk that the benefits of pursuing some of these changes may be marginal, and that we change simply for the sake of change. It's interesting that Goldman Sachs and Blackstone, among others, have just launched a new services firm with Anthropic to roll out AI across their portfolio companies. These companies recognize the opportunity that exists in AI, but also the challenges that currently exist of effectively integrating AI into their portfolio companies. If you've enjoyed this podcast, look out for future editions on your preferred platform, and particularly for our next podcast with Brian Murphy from Alpha Systems. As always, we welcome your suggestions for future guests or topics, so keep sending these to us throughout 2026. In the meantime, thanks for listening.